The tech marine's hands did not tremble. That was the first thing I registered when consciousness returned after the breach. Those hands, steady and deliberate, pressing sacred unguents into the fractured seam along my left pauldron, where bolter rounds had pried ceramite from its bonding resin and left the edges jagged and bright as broken teeth. His servo arm moved in complementary rhythm, applying bonding compounds with the same ritual economy he would use to reseal a sacred tome. The canticle he recited was not one of triumph. It was not one of healing. It was the litany of terminal expenditure, a prayer reserved for armor that would not be worn again. I knew it by its cadence before I could pass the words. I had heard it 3 times in 2 centuries. Once for Brother Pythias before the Ulvani breach, once for Brother Sergeant Corvath before the siege of Mancala Station. I had never expected to hear it for myself, and yet hearing it now produced no panic, no grief, no involuntary surge of self-preservation that might shame a lesser warrior. Only a slow recognition, like a door being confirmed locked from the outside. Sub-level 19 of the primary forge spire of Carthax Secundus smelled of machine oil and carbonized particulate. The grating beneath my knees was slicked with something dark that had pooled from a ruptured conduit during the previous assault phase. It was warm against my fingers where my gauntlet had cracked and the sensory feed had gone intermittent, offering me only occasional impressions of temperature rather than the full tactile relay I had relied upon for 160 campaigns. Heat, pressure, residual vibration from distant detonations. That was all the sub-level offered through that compromised interface, and it was enough. I did not require comfort. I required data. Tech Marine Voras completed the outer bonding pass and stepped back, servo arm retracting. He did not meet my eye through his faceplate, but his vox tone was precise and unhurried. Ceramite integrity is 43% across primary plating. Secondary heart function is degraded but stable within operational parameters. Neural shunt relay is compensating for the pressure differential across your left temporal port. Projected organ failure cascade begins at approximately 6 hours under sustained combat stress, accelerating to critical within 9. A pause, not hesitation, calculation. Gene seed retrieval probability, or given current positioning and projected corridor collapse, is assessed as acceptable by the machine god standard. Long-term survival probability is not assessed, Brother Sergeant. He said it the way a medici states a wound's severity, without cruelty, without softening. Not assessed, I repeated, not a question. The corridor will not permit apothecary access after the first collapse phase. Your gene seed is viable currently. That is acceptable. Acceptable. The word sat inside me for a moment. 212 years of service to the 4th Company had been distilled to the word acceptable, applied to the preservation of genetic material. I accepted this the way I accepted all strategic assessments, as data requiring response, not as injury requiring remedy. I rose. The armor compensated for my secondary heart's labored rhythm, the power plant redistributing load across the cerami fiber musculature. The pain was present. A deep, structural ache that lived behind my sternum, where the secondary heart pressed against reinforced bone. But pain in an Astartes is information, not impediment. I catalogued it and moved it to the periphery of my attention, where it could inform rather than distract. The 5 remaining members of my breach detail were positioned along the artery's first defensive choke point. Brother Demetria at the forward barricade, augmetic arm braced against a collapsed pipe housing. Brothers Tars and Holland occupying overlapping fields of fire across the secondary transit junction. Brother Veteran Solin standing at my right with his heavy bolter, still warm from the previous engagement. Brother Kessa, the youngest among us, sealing a shrapnel wound in his thigh with bonding foam while keeping his bolter raised and trained on the corridor's deeper darkness. 5. We had entered the sub-level with 11. The transit artery stretched ahead and behind us, like the interior of a dead machine's throat. Pipes ran the full length of ceiling and walls, some still hissing with residual pressure from the manufactory's circulatory systems. Others burst and silent. The overhead luminators had failed entirely in the central section, leaving only the pale amber glow of emergency strip lighting at floor level, casting long shadows upward so that the pipes became enormous ribs, and our armor, the black cause of something walking through a dead body's chest cavity. It was not poetry. I noted the observation only for tactical relevance. The lighting made Auspex compensation necessary, and depth estimation unreliable for unaugmented eyes. Any approaching force would face the same disadvantage. The corridor fought for no one. I took my position at the barricade beside Brother Demetria and pulled up the strategic overlay on my damaged helm display. It flickered. The left quadrant was entirely dead, leaving me with 3/4 of the tactical picture, which was sufficient. The artery ran approximately 900 meters from our position to the primary transit interchange above, where it met the industrial elevator shafts that climbed toward the forge spire's upper manufactorum levels. Behind us, the artery continued for another 400 meters before terminating at a sealed blast door I had ordered shut and magnetically bonded 40 minutes prior. We held the center. We held it because we had been ordered to hold it. That was the sum of the strategic requirement at that moment, and I found it sufficient. What entered my awareness at the outer edge of the Vox stream in that first minute of repositioning was not dramatic. It was procedural. A channel 2 frequencies above our designated tactical net carried clipped exchanges between Mechanicus Magi and orbital coordination personnel. Standard compliance traffic, words moving between sanctioned parties about sanctioned operations. I was not intended to filter that channel, but my damaged helm display had collapsed my channel segregation, throwing 3 adjacent frequencies into composite reception. I heard what passed between the Magi and the orbital staff, not by intent, but by the failure of the machine. Planetary surrender confirmation. Timestamp 6:42:09 local. Terms accepted by the Carthax Secundus planetary governor and surviving Forge Temple hierarchy. Compliance framework activated. Continue all active operations. That last phrase. Continue all active operations. In the geometry of Imperial siege doctrine, planetary surrender ends combat operations, except where pockets of resistance refuse to recognize the surrender authority. Active enemies continue to be engaged. Fleeing heretics are pursued. Hardened positions are reduced as a security measure. These are legitimate continuations. But the phrase used was not continue engagement of non-compliant elements. It was not continue suppression of surrendering holdouts. It was continue all active operations. And our active operation was classified in the strategic overview I had been issued before descent as transit artery denial and civilian route management. Civilian route management. I filed the phrase without responding to it. I had been trained to receive information and distinguish between operationally relevant and operationally irrelevant data. The channel's content was, by my assessment at that moment, background administrative traffic that did not pertain to my immediate tactical requirement. We held the artery. That was the requirement. We would hold it. Yet the phrase did not move to the periphery the way the pain did. It stayed near the center of my attention, lodged there without reason, until Demetria's voice cut through the vox. Movement ahead, 700 meters. And then the fighting resumed, and procedure filled every available space in my mind. The thing about bolter fire in an enclosed transit artery is that it does not sound the way it sounds in open combat. Above ground, in the manufactorum's outer courtyards, where we had spent the first 3 days of the breach phase, a bolter round produces a sharp crack and a concussive punch, the sound dispersing quickly into open air, the echo returning from distant walls as something flattened and manageable. Inside a 9-meter wide corridor, with pipes running floor to ceiling, and walls that are 3 meters of forged iron and bonded composite, each round becomes a separate event in a machine percussion. The concussion travels the length of the artery and returns layered, so that firing at an enemy 200 meters ahead means being simultaneously struck by the sound of that round, and the round fired 2 seconds before it, and the one 2 seconds before that, all arriving together as a wall of compressed air and noise that you feel through your ceramite as much as you hear it. I find it steadying. There is a rhythm in it that doctrine acknowledges. Fire, mark, adjust, fire. The pattern does not change because the environment becomes oppressive. Pattern is what distinguishes a space marine from what he fights. They come at you in waves, or in mobs, or in the disorganized surges that corrupted Skitarii produce when their command imperatives have been overridden by warp instinct. We stand in geometric certainty. We hold angles. We stack kills. The first wave numbered perhaps 60. Corrupted labor thralls at the fore, moving on damaged mechadendrite attachments that had fused wrong to their bodies. The organic and mechanical, mixed in ways that should not be compatible with continued locomotion, and yet were. Behind them, 8 Skitarii in shredded combat frames. The red of their robes faded to rust, and the white of their synthetic eye lenses cracked and glowing with something that was not standard mechanicus luminance, but something older and less ordered. Warp taint moves through the machine as easily as through the flesh. I had seen it on 14 worlds. It manifests in corrupted algorithms and in the way the light sits wrong in mechanical eyes. Demetria opened fire first, as she always did, because she was the best at range estimation in compromised visibility conditions. Her bolter's muzzle flash illuminated the corridor in strobing intervals, and in those white-orange pulses, I saw the shapes coming toward us clearly. The thralls stumbling over each other in the narrow space. The Skitarii pushing through the organic mass. The whole front of the formation compressing as it hit the choke point geometry that made the transit artery an excellent defensive position and an extremely poor avenue for assault. We killed them efficiently. There is no more honest way to describe the process. Solin's heavy bolter created a corridor of fire that bisected the thrall mass at approximately 40 meters out, and the detonating rounds did not merely wound but structurally compromised any organic or mechanical body within a meter of impact. The leading Skitarii died in the first 10 seconds of sustained fire. because the heavy bolters tracking engaged their higher threat signatures automatically, and Solin had been running that weapon for 60 years and did not waste movement. Demetria and Holland covered the flanks, ensuring nothing reached the barricade. Tarsi fired methodically into the compressed center of the thrall mass, where the choke point forced the greatest density. Kessa, still with bonding foam sealing his thigh, dropped to one knee at the barricade edge and fired controlled pairs. I fired continuously into the heaviest concentration and tracked the tactical picture through 3/4 of my helm display, and the compound impressions of sound and pressure that an Astartes develops over a century of active war. The choke point held. It always holds when it is properly constructed. This is doctrine. When the last corrupted Skitarii collapsed at 60 meters out, I called hold fire. The echo of the engagement moved down the corridor and returned, smaller each time, until sub-level 19 was quiet again, except for the hissing pipes and the distant harmonic vibration of bombardment somewhere far above us. I walked forward to assess. This is procedure. After an engagement, you assess. You confirm kill states, identify warp-active remains that require additional neutralization, check ammunition expenditure against expected wave frequencies, and gather any intelligence the dead carry. The thralls offered nothing useful. They were entirely corrupted. Any identification markers they might have carried obliterated by the biological changes that warp exposure had driven through them. The Skitarii were more intact, and I moved through their fallen forms quickly, checking for data cores and active mechadendrite hazards. It was the last Skitarii that I stayed at longest. The corrupted synthetic eye lenses had gone dark with death. The red robes were torn and stained, and in the amber glow of the floor lighting, the damage to the fabric was visible in specific detail. The right sleeve, from wrist to elbow, had been torn back, revealing the mechadendrite attachment port and the bare organic flesh above it. Around the wrist, tied above where the mechadendrite housing met skin, was a strip of white fabric approximately 4 centimeters wide, eyes knotted with a tight double loop that is not how a warrior binds a wound, not how industrial fabric is used to mark equipment, not how corrupted warp servitors decorate themselves. It was how people who wish to surrender mark their surrender. The white band was clean. It had not been on this wrist long. It had been tied with care, or at least with intention. The knot was neat. I looked at the second Skitarii, the left wrist, above the combat frame attachment. Another white band, identical width, identical knotting. I moved down the line of fallen thralls. The majority were too corrupted for me to be certain of what I was seeing beneath the biological alteration. The warp does things to flesh that makes visual assessment unreliable. But in those whose arms remained approximately human in structure, I found the same white fabric. Not all, but enough. 7 of the 11 fallen thralls I could examine with confidence bore the white bands. They had come down the corridor at us with surrender bands on their wrists. I stood in the amber-lit silence of the transit artery for several seconds processing this. My training sorted and resorted the data against tactical frameworks. Corrupted enemies do not tie surrender bands. Warp-influenced organisms do not perform symbolic compliance gestures. The logical inference was that the warp corruption was either cosmetic or recent, that these individuals had been physically driven forward rather than having charged of their own motivation, that someone behind them had herded them into our fire while they attempted to signal the opposite of aggression. I did not transmit this assessment immediately. I was aware, in the same moment, I processed the tactical inference of a choice I was making. The choice was not between honesty and deception. The choice was between two forms of report. I could transmit a complete assessment, including the white bands, and the inference that these individuals had been driven into our line of fire while attempting to surrender. Or I could transmit a casualty count and an ammunition status, which was the operationally required report, and which contained no dishonesty, because it contained no claim. I transmitted the casualty count and the ammunition status. The bodies remained where they fell. Kessa had moved back to the barricade. Sulin was already reloading. Demetria was watching the deep corridor ahead, utterly still. I rejoined the defensive line and said nothing about the white bands. The weight of that silence was not moral. I was not engaged in moral reasoning. I was engaged in tactical processing, and the white bands did not change our tactical requirement. We held the artery. The individuals who had been driven against us were warp compromised regardless of their intentions, or they would not have been herded this far into a sub-level that had been designated a sealed combat zone. The Imperium's processes for determining warp compromise were not dependent on the subjective intentions of the compromised individual. A corrupted body is a vector of corruption, regardless of what the consciousness within it believes or intends. The white bands were irrelevant to the outcome. This is what I told myself. I told myself this efficiently and completely, and then I stopped examining the subject. But the image of the knotted white fabric did not move to the periphery the way the pain did. An hour passed in the discipline of waiting. The ultramarine method for sustained defensive operations does not permit degradation of alertness over time, though it permits and in fact requires the structured allocation of rest and activity so that no battle brother is simultaneously required to be at maximum readiness, and no defensive position is ever left unmanned. We rotated attention in 30-minute cycles, 2 at full alert, 3 in active rest posture, where the body recovered within the armor, but the senses remained tracking. The armor's auto-senses compensated for the circadian instability that combat and sub-level confinement created. We were not tired in the way baseline humans became tired. We were depleted in the way machines became depleted, through consumption of resources that could not be replenished at current rates, through the accumulation of micro-damage that compounded rather than resolved. My secondary heart produced a sharp, irregular contraction at 47 minutes into the rest rotation. The pain was different from the background structural ache. It was sudden and specific, a fist closing briefly around the internal organ, and my neural shunts fired in response. The auto-response of an Astartes system designed to maintain function through biological stress. The armor registered the cardiac event and made adjustments, redistributed power supply, reduced demand on the torso's physical actuation, compensated for the drop in blood pressure by adjusting the suit's internal pressure support. All of this was invisible to my brothers. I stood at the barricade and appeared exactly as I had before the event, which was the purpose of the system. I catalogued the event as expected acceleration of the organ failure cascade. Voras had given me 6 hours before the cascade began under sustained combat stress. This was hour 1 of the hold. The first wave had been sustained combat. The adjustment to timeline was significant, not alarming. Significant. 40 minutes after the first assault, the Auspex relay on the eastern wall of the transit junction clicked on unexpectedly. The relay was not our relay. It was part of the sublevel's internal Mechanicus monitoring infrastructure, and it had been damaged in the first hour of our entry. Its signal intermittent and largely noise. But the current signal was not noise. It was a data burst from higher in the forge spire, feeding into the relay's passive buffer through some corrupted connection that had been established by the damage itself. The signal bled through with approximately 30% fidelity. I would have missed it entirely if the background noise of the Auspex had not changed tone. An experienced operator learns the difference between signal degradation noise and signal partial recovery noise. The pitch was different. I moved to the relay terminal and pulled what the buffer held. It was a visual feed, damaged 30% resolution, with significant scanline corruption. But visual, a column of people moving through a broad junction corridor 3 sub-levels above us. The corridor was what Mechanicus infrastructure documents called an evacuation throughway. Wide enough for 8 individuals abreast, the walls lined with direction lighting set to evacuation pattern yellow. The people moving through it were civilians by dress and posture, industrial labourers by the grey coveralls, and the respirator units many still wore at their waists. There were several hundred visible in the fragment of feed I could access, moving in a direction the corridor's reference markings identified as toward the emergency withdrawal lifts. At this distance, through 30% resolution, individual expressions were not identifiable, but movement patterns were. The movement was not chaotic. They were not fleeing. They were walking in orderly columns, following the evacuation lighting, compliant and directed and calm in the way that people who have been told they are being evacuated and who believe this are calm. The direction lighting guided them, not to the emergency withdrawal lifts. The lifts were to the north. I could confirm this from the forge spire's structural schematics in my tactical database. The direction lighting was guiding the column south. South, in that section of the forge spire, led to the processing vault complex. I knew what processing vaults were. Every compliance operation of sufficient scale involves them. Processing vaults are where populations are sorted, screened, catalogued, and in the cases where warp exposure or heresy is identified, terminated. They are standard infrastructure in large-scale compliance operations. They are not inherently sinister. They process. They assess. They separate the compliant from the non-compliant, and the non-compliant are handled by the processes the Imperium has determined appropriate. But processing vaults also have a secondary function, a function that is not in the operational briefing materials, but that is understood by any officer who has participated in a sufficient number of compliance actions. When a world has been deemed spiritually compromised beyond individual treatment, when the contamination is assessed as demographic rather than individual, the processing vaults serve a different function. They still receive. They process. They do not release. The evacuation lighting directing the column south. At the same moment, a voice entered the Vox on a channel I had not been monitoring actively, the General Astartes coordination frequency, which I had left in passive reception during the hold phase. A chaplain's voice. Not from our company. The cadence was ultramarines, but the vocal signature was unfamiliar, which meant another unit, possibly drawn from a different company or a transferred detachment. The words were familiar. They were the absolution liturgy of the imperial citizen, which is not a funeral rite and is not typically delivered during active evacuation operations. It is delivered when a large body of imperial civilians is about to die for the emperor's purpose, as an acknowledgement that their sacrifice, willing or otherwise, is sacred. The chaplain's voice was calm and smooth, and the words came in the ancient Gothic that all such liturgies use. The formal register that sounds like architecture, like weight-bearing stone. I listened to the liturgy and looked at the column of people walking toward the processing vaults. There was a moment, brief enough that I could not precisely measure it, long enough that I was aware of it as a moment, in which the two inputs aligned in my understanding and produced an inference I did not want to examine. I did not examine it. I moved the Auspex feed to secondary display and returned my primary attention to the corridor ahead. But I had not turned the feed off. It continued in the corner of my damaged helm display, 30% resolution, column still moving south. Demetria's voice from the barricade. Command frequency, Sergeant. Priority routing. I accepted the connection. The voice on the priority channel was not from our tactical operations officer. It was higher in the command architecture. A senior officer whose identifier I recognized from the 3rd Compliance's overall command structure. His voice was measured and clear, carrying the particular quality of authority that does not expect question. Brother Sergeant Alcaeus, 4th Company, confirm status and position. Sub-level 19 primary transit artery, northern barricade, 5 effectives. First wave neutralized. Secondary heart degraded. Position stable. Confirmed. Revised operational parameters for your assignment. You will hold transit artery access to sub-level 19 for 8 hours from timestamp 7:15. No extraction window will be opened. Your hold enables critical Mechanicus data purge operations and civilian asset processing on levels 17 through 22. These operations require 8 hours of uninterrupted security. Your squad is designated as Terminal Perimeter. Terminal Perimeter. The phrasing was new. It was not doctrine that I could reference, but its meaning was not obscure. Terminal meant what it sounded like. Command acknowledges gene seed recovery is non-optimal for this assignment, but acceptable within chapter standards. Understood, I said. Alcaeus, confirm that you hold until termination. There was a specific weight to the phrase. He was not asking me whether I would perform my duty. He was asking me to bind my squad's commitment over open command channel, to make the declaration of intent part of the archived record of the operation. This is a standard procedure for high-stakes final assignments. The confirmation becomes part of the compliance record, makes the compliance record is inviolable. Confirmed. 4th Company breach detail holds sub-level 19 transit artery until termination. The Codex Astartes commemorates your service, Brother Sergeant. The channel closed. I stood at the barricade for a moment after the channel closed and listened to the hissing pipes and the distant bombardment and the faint continuation of the chaplain's absolution liturgy on the general frequency, which I had not moved to inactive. On my secondary display, the evacuation column had reached the processing vault junction. The doors were sealed behind them. Kessa was watching me from his position. Not with suspicion, with the attentiveness of a young Astartes who has learned to read his sergeant for tactical inference. He did not speak. His eyes moved from my face to the secondary display, and then back. I closed the secondary display. Hold pattern continues, I said. Second wave within 40 minutes by Auspex estimate. TARS. Adjust your overlapping arc at 3 degrees east. The far wall's curvature is creating a blind angle at 260 meters. Holland, confirm your round count. They responded. We adjusted. The artery absorbed our movements and returned to its ambient state. Heat, pressure, the slow hiss of compromised pipe infrastructure, the amber glow of emergency lighting. I thought about the transit artery's geometry. 900 meters to the interchange above us. 400 meters to the sealed blast door behind us. 11 companions dead in the corridors between our entry point and this position. 5 remaining. 43% ceramic integrity on my primary armor. Secondary heart degraded. A gene seed recovery, non-optimal. The bulkhead seals I had ordered activated at the 2 primary retreat path junctions behind us. Ordered 40 minutes ago as defensive protocol to deny the enemy use of the maintenance crawl spaces for flanking, meant that those junctions were now one way. I had sealed them in both directions because that was the most secure interpretation of the protocol, and because, at the time, I had no reason to consider that we might need to move backward rather than holding forward. The possibility of upward withdrawal had not been part of my planning horizon when I made that decision. It was part of my planning horizon now. And the bulkheads were sealed and magnetically bonded, and I had ordered them sealed and bonded. What I noticed, in the gap between the channel closing and the second wave arriving, was that the corridor did not feel like a defensive position anymore. It felt like a box. It felt like a structure designed to contain something rather than to defend something. The barricade at the northern end was genuine. We had built it from collapsed pipe housing and debris in the first 20 minutes. And it was a real fortification. But barricades built inside boxes only function in one direction. They function to stop what comes from outside. They do not address what is already inside. We were already inside. I set my secondary heart's neural management routine to maximum compensation and returned to full tactical readiness, and said nothing about the geometry of the box to my brothers, because the geometry of the box did not change the tactical requirement. We held the artery. That was the requirement. The second wave came 50 minutes after the first. They were different. The first wave had been disorganized. The disorganization of corruption, of minds and bodies that had been partially subordinated to something other than command will. The second wave was not disorganized. They moved down the corridor in a loose formation that was not quite military, but had the remnants of structure in it, the kind of structure that comes from people who were once trained to something and who retain the muscle memory of formation, even when conscious command has broken down. Corrupted Skitari again, but fewer, perhaps a dozen, at the rear of a much larger group of perhaps 40 labor thralls. The thralls moved faster than the first wave, not because they were more corrupted, but because someone was driving them from behind. At 600 meters, through the damaged auspex, I could see the Skitari at the rear of the formation, pushing the thralls forward, prodding, herding. I held fire until 400 meters, which was not standard doctrine. Standard would have been to engage at maximum effective range. I held because at 400 meters, the resolution of my auspex was sufficient to confirm what I thought I was seeing at 600. The thralls at the front were not moving the way the first wave had moved. They were not charging. Their posture was not aggressive, and their pace was not attack pace. They were moving at the stumbling half-run of people who have been told to move or have been forced to move. Arms not raised in aggression, but held slightly outward for balance. Heads not lowered in assault posture, but raised and looking around. The body language of confusion and fear rather than corrupted aggression. At 350 meters, my auspex resolved enough detail, that I could see arms, white bands, not all of them, but many. The same width, the same neat double knot. Fresh white fabric in a corridor of grey industrial coveralls and torn red mechanicus robes. At 300 meters, the Skitari behind them opened fire into the back of the thrall formation. Not at us. Into the thralls' backs, the rounds punching through them, driving the front of the formation forward by sheer physical impact. Some fell. Those who fell were stepped on or over by those behind, who were also being pushed forward by the fire. It was not a wave. It was a stampede. It was being manufactured. Demetria had already sighted and was waiting for my command. Holland and Tars had their arcs set. Solin's heavy bolter was elevated and tracking. I gave the command. There was no alternative command to give. We fired into a stampede of people who bore white surrender bands and were being shot from behind. The tactical calculus was clean. The individuals approaching our position were warp compromised by classification. They were moving through a sealed combat zone. Their handlers were Skitaria, who were themselves corrupted. Their presence in sub-level 19 could only mean exposure to whatever warp taint had penetrated the sub-level's isolation. They could not be permitted to breach our barricade and potentially carry contamination into the upper access routes. They could not be redirected in the corridor's current configuration. They could not be detained or assessed. The choke point killed everyone who reached it with equal efficiency, and no distinction. All of this was tactically correct. I did not engage the tactical correction subroutine that normally accompanies a difficult engagement decision, the one that processes the decision as resolved and closes the query. The subroutine ran and completed, and the query should have closed. It did not close completely. Something at the edge of the query remained open, a small, persistent process that did not resolve, that ran its assessment again and again without reaching a different conclusion, and yet without accepting the conclusion it had reached. The engagement lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, there were 61 dead in the transit artery between our barricade and 500 meters forward of our position. 12 of them were the Skitari, who had herded the others. 49 of them were labor thralls, who had not been shooting at us and had been shot from behind. Brother Tars walked out to the 400-meter mark and retrieved one of the fallen body's white wristbands. He held it for a moment, looking at it through his faceplate. Then he set it down carefully on the dead person's chest and walked back to the barricade without speaking. I watched him do this. I said nothing about it. He resumed his firing position. His posture was unchanged, his readiness undiminished. He was an Astartes. He processed difficulty through function, as we all did, as I did. I recorded the engagement in my tactical log as second wave neutralized, all hostile units eliminated, position secure. The description was accurate. I did not add additional detail. I transmitted the log to the command frequency's passive archive, which was standard procedure. The archive received and confirmed. I did not add the detail about the white bands. I did not add the detail about the Skitari driving the others into our fire. These details were not operationally required in a standard tactical log. I chose not to add them. There is a distinction between not including unnecessary detail and omitting relevant evidence. I was aware of the distinction. I classified my omission as the former. The classification was not comfortable. It was functional. These are not the same thing, and I was aware they were not the same thing. My secondary heart contracted irregularly again, harder this time. The neural shunts fired in cascade, and my vision flickered briefly, a half-second during which the amber glow of the strip lighting strobed, and the corridor seemed to stretch before reasserting its correct dimensions. The armor compensated fully and immediately. No one observed the episode. I returned to the geometry. 6 hours and 41 minutes until the 8-hour window closed. 4 effectives. Kess's wound was more limiting than the bonding foam concealed. His movement speed reduced, and his armor's structural integrity at the thigh junction compromised enough that I had mentally reclassified him from full to limited. Solin, Demetria, Holland, Tars. Full effectives. Ammunition. 60% of initial load across bolters. Solin's heavy bolter at 52%. Medical. 1 apothecary dead, and 1 emergency kit between 5 warriors. These were the numbers. The numbers were what they were. I worked with them. An hour into the hold, the corridor admitted something other than a wave of corrupted fighters. A door I had not noted in the original structural survey, a maintenance access panel in the eastern wall at approximately 200 meters north of our barricade, opened outward and admitted a group of 3, Adeptus Mechanicus Magi, escorted by 4 Astartes warriors in unfamiliar livery. Their armor was clean. The ceramite was pristine. A deep grey with silver detail markings that did not match any chapter heraldry in my tactical database's extensive reference. The servo skulls that attended the Magi moved smoothly, undisturbed by the debris and casualties that littered the corridor around them. The 4 Astartes moved in a formation I recognized as close escort, not combat ready. Their bolters were holstered at their hips rather than held and raised, which told me their threat assessment classified our position as secure. They looked at us with the brief professional acknowledgement that Astartes give to fellow Astartes. A nod of the head, a small adjustment of stance that says, I see you, and I know what you are, and we are not in conflict. And then their attention returned to the Magi they were escorting. The lead Magos did not stop walking. He spoke while in motion, his voice carrying the machine-augmented resonance of high-ranking Mechanicus vocalization, the human component almost entirely subordinated to the synthetic projection. Brother Sergeant Alcaeus, 4th Company confirmation received. This corridor's access security is confirmed adequate. We proceed. His servo skulls turned their skull faces briefly in our direction, their lenses catching the strip lighting. Sub-level 19 houses a noospheric anomaly in the deep transit complex. Coordinates 779 by 314. This anomaly must be sealed with maximum thermal output. The seal procedure will initiate structural collapse in the lower artery section within approximately 2 hours of initiation. Your squad's position is within the collapse radius. He continued walking as he said this. I said, acknowledged. The Magos procession continued northward without pausing. The 4 grey-armoured Astartes followed, their eyes ahead. One of them, the rearguard, turned his faceplate toward me for a single second as he passed. His visor did not transmit anything. No acknowledgement, no soldier's nod. He simply looked, and then he was past. The maintenance door closed behind them. I considered the coordinates the Magos had provided. 779 by 314 in sub-level 19's coordinate grid. I pulled up the structural schematics in my tactical database and overlaid the coordinates. The noospheric anomaly the Magos had described occupied a position in the sub-level's deep complex that corresponded precisely, within a 10-meter variance that was within the standard imprecision of Forge Spire coordinate systems, to the processing vault complex, where the evacuation column on the Auspex feed had been directed. I held the overlay for several seconds, looking at the convergence of two data points. The processing vaults receiving the civilian column from above, the noospheric anomaly requiring thermal sealing in precisely the same complex. Thermal sealing is a procedure used to destroy organic material, corrupted noospheric data, and physical infrastructure simultaneously. It is the procedure of choice for permanently eliminating data cores that have been compromised by warp taint, because the thermal output destroys both the data and the physical medium on which it is stored, leaving no recoverable substrate. It is also the procedure used when a physical space itself has been contaminated in ways that cannot be addressed through decontamination, when the contamination is too extensive or too deeply embedded for targeted removal. It generates temperatures that no organic material survives. I closed the overlay. The coordinates sat in my tactical database with the same neutral designation as every other geographic data point, simply numbers in a system tied to nothing except location. They did not know what they described. They simply were what they were. I understood that the 8-hour window I was holding this corridor to protect was not primarily about Mechanicus data purge. Or rather, it was about data purge in the most complete sense. The elimination of the data stored in human bodies, the lives and histories and memories of the individuals who had walked south following evacuation lighting that had not taken them to evacuation craft, and the data purge above, the rewriting of planetary records, which I had inferred from the operational parameters, required time because the records being rewritten included the records of those individuals' existence. Processing vault logs, labor assignment databases, population censuses. All of it would be brought into alignment with an outcome in which those individuals had never been present when the compliance was completed, or had been classified as warp casualties in the breach operations, or had simply been absorbed into the general notation of conflict-related civilian losses that all compliance reports carry. We were holding the corridor so that the burning was protected, and the record of the burning was erased before any report went to a planetary governance level that might question the numbers. I stood at the barricade, and I accepted this understanding with the same clinical flatness with which I had accepted Vorus's assessment of my survival probability. Not because I had no capacity for response, because I was trained to separate understanding from reaction, and because the understanding did not change the tactical requirement, and because I was an Ultramarines brother sergeant in the execution of a confirmed operational order, and because my secondary heart was failing in my chest, and because the doors behind me were sealed, and because I had confirmed over open channel that we would hold until termination, because the compliance record was inviolable, because all of this was correct. The third wave arrived in the 5th hour. By then, Holland was dead. He had taken a penetrating hit from a corrupted Skitari plasma weapon in the 4th hour, the shot punching through the ceramite at his left hip, where his armor had been compromised in an earlier engagement during the entry phase. The wound had initially appeared manageable. Astartes' physiology suppresses blood loss to an extraordinary degree, and Holland had continued fighting for 40 minutes after the hit. But in the transit artery's heat and contamination, with no apothecary available, the wound had become something else. And at the beginning of the 5th hour, he had knelt down against the eastern wall, and his armor had locked in place for stability as his body's capacity to maintain function dropped below the threshold his suit could compensate for. He looked, from a distance, as if he were praying. He had been Holland. He had served for 120 years. He had a particular laugh, infrequent. But when it emerged, it was large and genuine, and surprised you because his face in repose had the stillness of someone who did not laugh. I had heard it perhaps 8 times in 12 years of working alongside him. I thought of this when I saw him kneel and lock and understood what was happening. I thought of it for exactly 1 second. Then I redistributed the defensive firing arc to account for his gap. There was no other appropriate response. The third wave was the largest. Perhaps 90 combatants, a mixture of thralls and corrupted tech servants and something newer, with 3 figures in the remains of administrative robes, who moved with a mechanical precision that suggested deep warp architecture in their motor functions. Not mere corruption, but active possession. These 3 I designated priority targets, and Solon engaged them at maximum range. The heavy bolters sustained fire, tracking their inhuman movement patterns. The engagement lasted 11 minutes, and we held the barricade with 4 effectives. Kessa, whose wound had worsened through the combat of the previous hours, operated at significantly reduced capacity. He could hold his position and fire, but could not maneuver, and I had placed him at the barricade's most sheltered position to compensate. He fired with controlled precision that spoke to his training. Every round placed rather than expended, or at the discipline of a warrior managing limited means. When it ended, I was aware that I had not eaten or received medical support for 6 hours, that my secondary heart was now producing rhythmic irregularity at intervals of approximately every 12 minutes rather than the prior 20, and that the 8th hour window was approximately 2.5 hours from closing. In the interim of quiet after the 3rd wave, the Vox carried something I had not expected. The tech marine Voras, who had sealed my armor at the beginning of this assignment, and who I had not heard from since, reappeared on my private channel. His voice was the same, precise, unhurried, carrying the mechanicus quality of information delivered without the implication of emotional investment. Brother Sergeant Alcaeus, update for your operational record. Orbital calibration has been completed. Thermal inversion sequence is confirmed initiated from coordinates 779 by 314. Structural cascade in sub-level 19 is projected to reach your position within 2 hours and 14 minutes from this transmission. Gene seed extraction is not operationally viable. Authorization from Chapter Command has been received for terminal assignment protocol. Your gene seed will be recorded as lost in the engagement, and the chapter's loss rolls will reflect this with appropriate ceremony. He paused. You are thanked for exemplary adherence to the Codex Astartes and to the operational requirements of the 3rd compliance of Carthax Secundus. The 4th company honors your name. I listened to this. Received, I said. Is there anything you require for your final operational record? I considered the question. It was asked sincerely, in the mechanicus manner. An information request, not a courtesy. He wanted to know if there was data I needed to transmit, not if there was comfort I required. The record is current, I said. Confirmed. May the Omnissiah receive your machine soul, Brother Sergeant. The channel closed. This was his farewell. It was the farewell of a tech marine. Information, resource management, and the closing ritual. Not insufficient, simply precise. I remained at the barricade and processed the 2 hours and 14 minutes as a tactical timeline. My secondary heart contracted hard enough that for 3 seconds my vision reduced to peripheral, the amber strip lighting becoming a ring around a darkness that lasted only seconds and then resolved. The neural shunts fired in full cascade this time, my armor pouring everything it had into maintaining systemic function. The pain was considerable. I did not make a sound. My brothers were watching the corridor. They did not need to know the precise status of my failing organ. They knew enough. We all knew enough. Kessa was watching me, though. He watched with the attentiveness he had watched me with since the beginning of the hold. His eyes were steady, and his posture was composed, and he said nothing. But he watched. I met his gaze through 2 sets of cracked and dimmed faceplate lenses, and held it for a moment. He nodded once. That was all. It was the correct communication. Anything more would have been surplus. Solin spoke from his heavy bolter position, his voice low and deliberate. "Sergeant, permission to speak." "Granted. The squad understands the parameters. We're not requesting alternatives." His tone was not heavy with meaning. It was factual, the way Solin was always factual. "I'm asking if Command has given you any reason to transmit a priority flag before the collapse sequence." He was not asking if Command was wrong. He was not asking me to evaluate the legitimacy of what was happening above us in the processing vaults, or in the civilian columns, or in the rewritten records. He was asking, in the precise language of a veteran Astartes, who had served long enough to recognize the difference between assignment and assignment, whether there was a procedural recourse that should be attempted, not because he doubted the assignment, because if such a recourse existed and was not attempted, the failure to attempt it would itself be a procedural irregularity. He was asking on behalf of correctness. I said, "Command has full operational awareness. No flag is indicated." He nodded and returned his attention to the corridor. This was not quite true, and we both knew it was not quite true, and neither of us said anything more about it. I had been composing a transmission in my head for the past hour. A battlefield report. Not a priority flag. Not an accusation. Not a petition. A report. The report would contain what I had observed, in the language of objective tactical record, because that was the only language available to me in this medium and in this role. White surrender bans on individuals directed into our fire. Civilian columns directed to processing vault complex rather than evacuation craft. Thermal inversion coordinates overlapping civilian containment coordinates. Noospheric anomaly sanitization timeline, correlating with civilian population processing time. The report would contain only these observations. It would make no interpretation. It would present no moral position. It would be a data transmission from a field operative, containing data that was available from this field position and not yet represented in the operational record. I had not transmitted it yet because I had been considering whether it would change anything, whether it would produce a different outcome for anyone. The civilians in the processing vaults were either already dead or would be dead before any report I transmitted could alter command decisions. The orbital calibration was confirmed initiated. The structural cascade was underway. The 8-hour window was at its final phase. The report would not save anyone. It would not alter the outcome of the operation. It would not change the records that were being rewritten. Those records were being overwritten by Mechanicus Magii with the authority of the Adeptus Mechanicus, which outweighed any field report I might generate. It would not alter the chapter's loss rolls, which had already been prepared to reflect gene seed lost in combat. What it would do, if it entered the operational archive, was exist. A data point, a record from a position inside the operation, with timestamps and coordinate references and tactical observations that described something other than what the sanitized compliance record would describe. Whether such a record would survive the archival process was a separate question. Whether the archival process would flag it for restriction was a question I already had the answer to. I transmitted it anyway. I formatted it as a standard battlefield report, the notation exactly as doctrine required. Reporting element, position, timestamp, observed tactical data, category, intelligence. I listed the white bands. I listed the Auspex feed redirect of civilian columns. I listed the coordinate overlap. I listed the Tech Marines timeline for structural collapse relative to civilian processing vault timeline. I listed all of it in the clean, uneditorialized language of a field report, because that was what it was. And because field reports do not argue, and they do not accuse, and they simply describe what a set of sensors in a specific location at a specific time recorded. I ended with status current, position holding, no requests for support or extraction. I transmitted to the General Command Archive. The archive system acknowledged receipt within 2 seconds. Then it returned a flag. Transmission received. Archival restriction applied under Compliance Protocol 7. Content classified at Magisterium Internal Security level pending review. Magisterium Internal, the classification level above which information does not exit the senior command stratum without specific authorization from that stratum. Effectively, the report would exist in the archive, sealed and inaccessible, until someone with magisterium authority decided to unseal it, which would not happen. The report would exist in a locked room that no one would open. I had transmitted it anyway. I do not know what I expected this to produce. It produced nothing. The corridor remained the corridor. The collapse was proceeding. But the report existed. That was a fact that remained true, regardless of whether anyone ever accessed it. The words I had used were correct, and the data I had included was accurate, and it had been recorded somewhere, in some deep stratum of the archival network. And whether it mattered was a different question from whether it existed. It existed. That was something. I am not certain what kind of something, but it was not nothing. The fourth wave never fully materialized. What came down the corridor 40 minutes before the collapse sequence reached our position was not organized resistance, but the remnants of resistance. Scattered individuals, corrupted, some barely mobile, the last dregs of whatever hostile presence had been funneled into the sub-level throughout the operation. We killed them with efficiency, appropriate to their degree of threat, which was low. Kesser's performance during this phase was diminished. His wound had entered a phase where the bonding foam was no longer adequate, and the tissue beneath it was failing in ways that his armor's compensation systems could not fully mask. He fired from a seated position, with his back against the barricade, reload capable, but not mobile. He didn't complain about this. He didn't need to. 25 minutes before the 8-hour window closed, the chaplain entered the command channel. He identified himself as Chaplain Varos of the 3rd Compliance Command Detail. His voice had the particular quality of chaplains, the absolute absence of doubt as a tonal component. Not the certainty of someone who has never considered alternatives, the certainty of someone who has considered them and found them insufficient and moved past them permanently. Chaplains do not arrive at certainty easily. When they speak from it, the certainty is load-bearing. Brothers of the 4th Company breach detail. You have held your assigned position against sustained enemy contact for 7 hours and 35 minutes. The primary operational objectives of the 3rd Compliance of Carthax Secundus are confirmed complete. The world is reclaimed for the Imperium of Man. I listened. Your sacrifice is consecrated, not by ceremony. Ceremony is for those who will survive to observe it. Your sacrifice is consecrated by its necessity and by your willing completion of it. The Emperor does not require that you understand the fullness of his design. He requires that you hold the line he places you on until he calls you forward. The words were beautiful in the way that doctrine is beautiful, precisely calibrated to the purpose of the individual receiving it. He was not lying to us. He believed everything he said. That was the most important thing about chaplains. They did not deliver comfort falsely. They delivered comfort that was true within the framework of their understanding. And within the framework of their understanding, everything he said was accurate. Remaining active brothers of the breach detail will now receive the final compliance rites. This is the Catechism of Willing Extinction. You know its words. Speak them with me. I had known the words since my 8th year in the Scout cohort. They are among the oldest liturgical formulations in the Ultramarines' ceremonial body. A catechism developed after the heresy, when Guilliman's architects recognized that some operations required warriors who would not return and who deserved a rite that acknowledged both the fact of their ending and the willingness with which they met it. The Catechism of Willing Extinction is not a prayer for survival. It is a statement of deliberate choice. The chaplain spoke the first line. My brothers and I repeated it. I am the Emperor's weapon in the final hour of its use. The second, I am spent in his service, and I am not diminished by expenditure. The third, my ending is the weapon's sheathing and the battle's sealing. The fourth, I go forward because the path is forward, and there is no other direction in which duty walks. The fifth, I do not ask to be remembered. I ask only that the line I held be worth the holding. There were 12 lines in the catechism. We spoke them in sub-level 19 at approximately 60 meters below a burning processing vault complex, in the amber light of failing emergency strips, with Holland dead against the eastern wall, and Solin kneeling at his heavy bolter, and Demetria and Tars and Kessa completing the words in voices that were level and clear and unbroken. When we finished, St. Chaplain Varos spoke a single closing phrase in High Gothic that I will not attempt to transcribe because the full liturgical weight of it requires both the High Gothic and the memory of the voice to carry. The channel closed. I knelt at the barricade, not from injury, from choice. The catechism requires you to kneel at its conclusion. It is the physical correlate of the spiritual position, the acknowledgement that you have descended from the standing posture of the warrior at arms to the kneeling posture of the completed weapon. It is not defeat. It is formal completion. Kessa, from his seated position against the barricade, looked at me. I said, You understand you have served with distinction. Yes, Sergeant, he said. You entered the sub-level, knowing the parameters. You held without complaint through injury. You shot carefully and didn't waste what we had. He didn't say anything. His eyes were steady. That is the complete record of what happened to you, I said. Not the record that will be written. the record of what actually occurred. You were here and you did this, and it was as good a thing as anything I have seen done in 200 years. This was not appropriate sergeant-to-battle brother communication. It was personal. I made it anyway. "Sergeant," he said, "what actually happened here?" He was not asking about the tactical history of the breach operation. He was asking about the thing we had not spoken about since the first white band, since the Auspex feed showing the civilian column, since the Margos descending with his thermal coordinates, since all of it accumulating in the corridor around us like sediment. I said, we held a corridor while a world's population was killed for administrative reasons. The world had petitioned against its tithe. The response to that petition took some years to arrive, and arrived in the form of compliance action predicated on warp contamination that may have been real, but was insufficient as a basis for total erasure. The erasure was an economic decision expressed through military doctrine. We provided the military doctrine. The warp contamination gave the action legitimacy. We provided the legitimacy by dying in it. I had never said these words before. I had assembled the understanding over the course of 7 hours and 37 minutes, but I had not formed it into language until this moment. Forming it into language made it different, not more or less true, different in texture. It had weight as language that it did not have as pattern recognition. Kessa received this. He did not recoil from it. He was young, but he was Astartes, and Astartes are made for hard data. "Is it wrong?" he asked. This was the question at the bottom of the 7.5 hours. I sat with it for a moment. "I do not know what wrong means at this scale," I said. "I know what the Codex Astartes requires. I know what the Imperium requires. I know that a world that questions the tithe is a problem the Imperium resolves, in the only way it is capable of resolving it. I know that millions of people died below us, and that their deaths were procedurally correct, and that correct and righteous are not necessarily the same category. And I know that I am an Astartes, and that Astartes are made to exist within a system that is larger than any individual judgment, and that the system has been kept together by exactly this, by the refusal to allow individual judgment to override collective necessity. But the people who tied white bands to their wrists were trying to survive. They believed in the possibility of surrender. They believed that the Imperium would accept it. They were not wrong that surrender was offered. They were wrong that it would be honored. And that is something the Imperium taught them, that surrender is possible, and then used as an instrument against them. Kessa was quiet. "It is not wrong in the way that a sin is wrong," I said. "It is wrong in the way that a machine that does exactly what it was designed to do is wrong when it was designed to do something that should not have been designed. The machine is functioning perfectly. The wrongness is in the blueprint, and the blueprint is not mine to alter." I was aware, as I said this, that I was doing the thing I had been trained not to do, conducting moral analysis detached from tactical requirement. The words were arising from something happening, from the immediacy of the corridor, from the catechism still sitting in my chest, from Holland kneeling against the wall behind me, and Kessa watching me with clear eyes. And so, they were legitimate under the rules I had been given for my own thought. They arose from something real, but they went somewhere I had been trained to avoid. I let them go there anyway, because there were 12 minutes left in the 8-hour window, and the collapse sequence had been producing structural harmonics in the deep corridor for the past 40 minutes. the vibration moving up through the grating in waves that my ceramite transmitted directly to my body. And there was not enough time left for the consequences of this conversation to matter. And because Kessa deserved an honest answer to his honest question. "We did not choose the blueprint," he said. "No. We held the line they gave us." "Yes. That has to mean something." I looked at him. "It means exactly what it means and nothing more. We held the line. The line did not need holding in the way we were told it needed holding. It needed holding for reasons we were not told. We did not know. And then, during the holding, we came to know, and we continued to hold anyway, because there was no available alternative, and because we had committed our confirmation over open channel, and because we are what we are. Is that service? It is what service looks like, when the thing you are serving is this large and this old, and has moved this far from the thing it claims to serve. Yes, it is still service. It is not the same as the service described in the Catechism. It is the service that actually exists inside the Catechism. The structural harmonic intensified. A crack propagated along the ceiling of the corridor, beginning at approximately 300 meters ahead and moving toward us with the slow, deliberate speed of infrastructure, failing under load rather than under explosion. Pipes stressed, when a section of ceiling paneling 50 meters forward dropped and struck the grating with a sound that was less like a crash and more like a deep, tired exhalation. "Sergeant," Demetria said. "Observed," I said. I stood from my kneeling position. The armor resisted for a moment. The locking mechanism had engaged partially, the armor settling into a stability configuration that recognized my diminished physical capacity. I overrode it manually, and it released, reluctantly. Solin had laid his heavy bolter down carefully on its side, the barrel aligned with the barricade edge in the precise manner of someone placing a valued tool rather than abandoning a weapon. He was standing behind the barricade, with his hands at his sides. Demetria and Tars stood together. They were not embracing. They were simply close, shoulder to shoulder, or in the way that battle brothers stand when they are at the end of something, and no further tactical action is available. Kessa, from his seated position, had closed his hand around the white wristband that Tars had retrieved from the second wave's fallen, and set aside. He was holding it. He did not look at it. He held it. I had a thought about Brother Holland and his 8 genuine laughs, and decided that the thought was good, and that it should remain where it was, in the honest record of my last hour, which was being kept only inside me, and would not be transmitted anywhere, because I had already transmitted everything transmittable, and the rest was my own. The harmonic deepened. The strip lighting flickered, not in the random way of electrical failure, but in the rhythmic way of power cables stressed by structural movement, the lights pulsing with the flex and release of the building around them. Each pulse was shorter than the last. My secondary heart stopped. Not faltered. Stopped. The neural shunts responded with a full emergency cascade, the armor pouring maximum systemic support into cardiac function maintenance, the primary heart adjusting immediately to compensate for full load. The pain was totalizing for approximately 3 seconds, the kind of pain that exists below cognition, that the Astartes body is designed to receive and continue functioning through, but that registers at the level of something fundamental and irreversible occurring. Then the primary heart assumed full function, and the pain redistributed into the background of my awareness, lower but constant, the new baseline. I was aware that the clock inside my armor had shifted its projection. The cardiac event had moved the organ failure cascade timeline forward. The primary heart was now carrying full load under structural failure conditions in a toxic atmosphere, with cumulative combat damage from 7.5 hours of engagement. The primary heart would continue for some time, but the timeline was different now. I did not update my brothers with this information. There was no actionable use for it. They could see the ceiling dropping sections. They could feel the grating vibrating. They did not require my cardiac event data to understand what the next few minutes would contain. The lights pulsed once more and went out. For a full second, sub-level 19 was completely dark. The amber of the emergency strips had been fed by a conduit that the structural movement had now severed. My helm's autosenses shifted to passive low-light amplification in the same instant, catching the faint residual heat signatures of the corridor, the pipes, the cooling weapon barrels, my brothers, the dead behind us and ahead of us, all rendered in the amber green of thermal imaging rather than the amber of engineered lighting. Everything looked the same in both colors. The deep corridor was beginning to compress. I could hear it. Not the sharp sounds of explosion, but the slow groaning of metal under load, the tectonic language of a building rearranging itself around a thermal event below. The thermal inversion from coordinate 779 by 314 was rising. The processing vaults were burning completely. What burned in them I did not look at in my mind, because there was nothing useful in looking at it, and there was nothing I could do about what it contained. And the looking would only produce a result that had no outlet. What I thought about instead was the question Kessa had asked. Is it wrong? I had given him an answer that was honest, but there was a part of the question I had not answered, or that I had answered without acknowledging what I was answering. The part that was not about the Imperium's design, or the tithe economics, or the procedural structure of compliance operations. The part that was simply about this: whether standing in this corridor, having seen what I had seen, having transmitted a report that would never be read, having spoken the catechism of willing extinction with the full knowledge of what the extinction was willing, whether this constituted something that had meaning, not meaning in the archival sense, not meaning in the doctrinal sense, meaning in the most immediate and personal sense. Had I done something that mattered? The corridor groaned. A section of piping 12 meters ahead deformed laterally, the steel flowing rather than breaking under the heat differential rising from below. The grating began to glow faintly at the junctions, not red but the deep pre-red of metal that is receiving enormous thermal input from its structural connections. I thought, I had been here. I had seen these things. I had recorded them as accurately as my instruments and my understanding allowed, and the recording existed somewhere in an archive that might never be opened, sealed under a classification that was designed to prevent exactly what it prevented, which was information entering any record that might be acted upon. I had held a corridor that did not need holding in the way I was told it needed holding. I had killed people who were trying to surrender. I had done this not from malice, but from compliance, and compliance at the level of my training and my institutional formation and my 2 centuries of consistent service is not the same as the individual moral failing of a single soldier who knew better and chose otherwise. The system had made me. And the system had directed me, and the system had produced the outcome through me with the same efficiency that the thermal inversion was producing its outcome below. And yet I had composed the report. I had transmitted it, knowing it would be restricted. I had said something true to Kessa in the last minutes available for true saying. I had carried the image of the white wristbands and of Tars setting the band gently on the dead person's chest, and I had not resolved these images into clean tactical data. Whether this mattered was a question with no available answer in the time I had remaining. What I knew was that the people in the processing vaults had been people, that their deaths had been procedurally correct, that correct and righteous were not the same category, that I believed in the Emperor, believed with the full force of 2 centuries of service, and the genetic imprint of Gilliman's lineage, and the accumulated weight of every catechism I had spoken, and that my belief did not require the Emperor's instrument to be righteous in order to be sacred, and that this was both the strength and the horror of the faith I carried, that it could absorb everything and continue. The ceiling above our position began to move. Not catastrophically, not the instant collapse of a bomb-damaged structure, but the definitive geological movement of a subsystem failing under thermal stress, the ceiling descending at a measurable rate that would reach the floor in some number of minutes that my armor's structural analysis software was no longer capable of estimating with the required sensor accuracy. The grating was heating. My armor's thermal management was working at full capacity. Solin reached across and placed his hand on Demetria's pauldron. It rested there for a moment. She did not move. Then he removed it and returned to standing. Tarsu was reciting something low under his breath. I listened. It was not the catechism. It was the oath of moment, the personal oath spoken before a specific engagement, the oath that binds a single warrior to a single action. He was speaking it very quietly, in the way you speak something when you are saying it for yourself, rather than for anyone listening. I heard, I am the last thing between the enemy and the people I protect. He had heard the same Vox transmissions I had heard. He had seen the same Auspex feeds. He was speaking the oath of moment with the full knowledge that what he was reciting was not accurate to the operation's reality. And he was speaking it anyway, because the oath was true in the way it was intended to be true, regardless of what the operation had been. He had fought here, and he had protected something, even if it was only the possibility that someone who would never be born in a generation, that would never know this corridor, had been worth protecting. He was making it true by saying it. I thought this was the most honest thing I had seen in 7 hours and 45 minutes of the most dishonest operation of my career. My primary heart adjusted its rhythm to the changed load. The armor compensated. The grating's heat was pressing through the soles of my boots now. A patient insistence rather than a sudden assault. Kessa, now still holding the white wristband, looked at me through 2 cracked faceplates in the thermal imaging amber green of the corridor. Are we doing this correctly? He asked. It was not the same question as before. It was simpler and more immediate. He was not asking about the operation's legitimacy. He was asking about the catechism, the posture, the final procedure of it all, whether we were dying in the correct way. Yes, I said, we are doing this correctly. He nodded. He placed the white wristband on the grating beside him, set it down with deliberate care, straightened it, In the thermal imaging, it was a pale smear of cooler colour against the warming metal. I thought about the fifth line of the Catechism. I do not ask to be remembered. I ask only that the line I held be worth the holding. And the line had not been worth the holding in the way I was told. It had been worth the holding in no way that the compliance record would acknowledge. But Kessa had asked me a question and received an honest answer. And Tarsi had spoken an oath over a dead enemy and tried to make it true. And the report existed in a restricted archive where it would not be found and would not matter and would still exist. And I had spent 7 hours and 47 minutes understanding something that I had spent 200 years accepting without understanding. Whether understanding without the capacity to act on the understanding is a form of victory or a form of defeat is a question I did not resolve before the ceiling reached us. The structural collapse was not the percussive event of a demolition charge. It was continuous and total, and it came in the way that geological processes come, inevitable and indifferent to the scale of what it subsumed. The ceiling descended and the walls pressed, and the thermal inversion rose from below, and the corridor that I had sealed and held for 7 hours and 53 minutes became something that was no longer a corridor in any functional sense. My armor locked fully. The final stability configuration. All available power redirected from mobility to structural resistance. In this configuration, the armor becomes essentially a sealed container around the body, maximally resistant to external pressure and maximally insulating against thermal transfer. It can maintain this configuration for a limited time against limited forces, against the complete structural collapse of a forge spire sublevel under thermal inversion. The limitation was not generous. In the armor's locked configuration, with the external sensors still transmitting to my internal displays, I was able to observe the final few minutes of the corridor with the same clarity I had observed the first. The strip lighting was gone, but the thermal differential was its own imaging system. I could see Solin, locked and still. Demetria and Tarsi, together. Kessa, smaller than the others in the confined space. The chronometer on my internal display read 7 hours, 57 minutes, 42 seconds into the 8-hour window. I watched it reach 7 hours, 58 minutes. My primary heart continued to function. This surprised me in a mild and clinical way. The organ was under enormous load, and the cascade I had been warned about was fully engaged, but the organ continued to function because it was designed to continue, because Astartes' hearts are over-engineered to levels that exceed any reasonable prediction of what they will be required to endure. And what they are required to endure is always more than any reasonable prediction. 7 hours, 59 minutes. I thought about the report in the restricted archive. I thought about the fifth line of the Catechism. I thought about Holland's 8 genuine laughs, and about the white wristband on the grating beside Kessa. I thought about the geometry of the corridor, and about Gilliman, who designed the doctrine within which all of this occurred, and whether Gilliman had known that the doctrine would be used this way, or whether this was the predictable consequence of a system that he had built to be robust rather than righteous, and whether those were the same thing at the scale of 10,000 years. I thought about the people in the processing vaults who had followed yellow direction lighting toward what they believed was salvation. I thought they were people. This thought contained everything and resolved nothing, and I carried it. 8 hours. The chronometer reached 8 hours and continued counting. The ceiling was on my pauldrons. My armor's structural resistance was engaged at maximum. The thermal input was approaching the threshold of ceramite phase transition, the temperature at which ceramite ceases to be a stable solid and becomes something less coherent. This is not a theoretical temperature. It is a documented temperature from the material data sheets that all tech marines keep or in their sacred volumes. I had known this temperature abstractly since my training. I was now knowing it concretely and specifically. The corridor continued to compress. The thermal data from the processing vaults below was visible as a rising gradient in the floor and walls. I heard, very faintly through my external audio pickups, a sound that was not structural. It was human, or had been human. It was coming from the deep corridor ahead, from the direction of the sealed blast doors that I had ordered bonded closed 8 hours ago, from the direction of the coordinates 779 by 314. I have catalogued this sound, and I will not describe it in detail, because detail is not what it requires. It was the sound of the thermal inversion's work. It carried the information that the work was being completed. I made no response to this sound. There was no response available to me. My armor's chronometer continued counting past 8 hours with perfect accuracy. The accuracy of imperial chronometers is one of the enduring achievements of the Mechanicus. They count without adjustment, without drift, without any concession to the significance or insignificance of what passes between their tick intervals. They count when warriors fall, and when worlds burn, and when records are rewritten, and when nothing at all is happening, in a quiet corridor, on an unimportant world. They count because counting is what they do. At 8 hours and 4 minutes, my primary heart's sustained function exceeded the projected organ failure cascade timeline. I catalogued this not as triumph, but as further data. The ceramite at my right shoulder was at phase transition threshold. I was aware of several things simultaneously in the final interval. I was aware that the compliance record for the third compliance of Carthax Secundus would list minimal resistance in the lower sublevels and 0 civilian casualties in the breach operation and exemplary performance by 4th Company forces assigned to terminal perimeter duty. I was aware that the record would also list me as killed in action against warp-corrupted Mechanicus elements, which was the classification that made the terminal perimeter assignment comprehensible as a conventional combat death. I was aware that the world above this corridor would eventually be repopulated, and that new workers would arrive, and that the tithe would resume, and that the manufactorum's records would not contain any notation of what had occurred in the processing vaults or the transit arteries. I was aware that this was the Imperium functioning as designed. I was aware that I had believed in the Imperium for 212 years, and that I believed in it still, in the specific way that I believed in it, not as a righteous institution, but as a necessary one, not as a vehicle for human flourishing, but as the only structure between humanity and the void's many appetites for its ending, and that necessary and righteous were not the same category, and that I had known this abstractly for a long time, and had needed a corridor in a sublevel and a white wristband on a dead person's wrist to know it concretely. I was aware that Kessa was younger than all of us, and had served with complete commitment, and had asked good questions in the time available for questions, and had held the white wristband until near the end, and set it down carefully. I was aware that the line between what I believed and what I had done was exactly the distance between a catechism and the place it describes, and that I had always lived inside one of those two things, and had only now, in the final minutes, understood which one. I was aware that my primary heart was still functioning. The awareness ended at 8 hours and 9 minutes into the window, when the thermal inversion reached the transit artery at sub-level 19's northern choke point, and the ceramite resolved into its elemental components, and the corridor completed its function as a container. Above, the forge spire of Carthax Secundus continued to stand. Its upper manufacturing levels were intact. The workforce processing operations were completed. The Mechanicus data purge had been accomplished on schedule. The compliance record archived cleanly. Minimal resistance, 0 civilian casualties, exemplary Astartes commitment. The transit artery of sub-level 19 was sealed by thermal event and structural collapse, consistent with documented combat damage. The population of Carthax Secundus had been 147 million at the time of the third compliance's initiation. The compliance record listed combat-related civilian casualties at 12,411, consistent with the contested urban breach phase. New labour contracts were issued within 6 months. Transit ships brought workers from 3 adjacent systems. The tithe resumed at full quota. The world did not remember what it had forgotten, because the remembering required records that no longer existed, and witnesses who had not survived the compliant. In the restricted archive, sealed under magisterium internal classification, a battlefield report dated to the 7th hour of the transit artery hold contained coordinate references and tactical observations that described, in the clean and unargumentative language of field reporting, something that differed from the compliance record on several specific points. The archive did not open. The world rebuilt. Nothing that had been done was technically wrong.